I'm going to read you a little story. And yes, I know you're not supposed to read when you stand and lecture at a conference, but I can assure you that this story has been very well tested by my friend Solveig Janke, who a couple of days ago read it as a bedtime story to her daughter with great success. Her daughter fell asleep very soundly with a smile on her face. So please relax and enjoy. I changed the title from a short riff on mobility to a hyper-local riff on mobility, respecting the theme of this conference. You maybe know riff. It's a musical term from jazz, a kind of improvisation, because I think, in fact, I'm not very good at making logical arguments. So it will be a bit all over the place. And hyperlocal, I really don't know what it is, except it was on the internet saying it's a kind of journalistic term of a very local community in a very small radius. And I thought it's very interesting if you reduce this radius into a kind of crazy small dimension and you get a community of just one. So it's me. So this jazz, this riff is about the problematic hyper-locality of a single person. This hyper-locality goes back to the very start of humanity, I suppose, when everything was local. Humans sought out comfort in a physical space, and after a long while built many little hyper-localities into a city. And then finally into ecosystems like this one, Portus, which I discovered was a 2nd century Roman construction where people, transport, architecture, and of course a vision of the world all came together. That's surely where urban civilization is now, a dynamic community of many hyper-local egos desperately looking for a place, a presence in real and metaphorical terms. Yes, in apartments, offices, and houses, but also on the internet and on devices that move. Architecture, more or less, defines the real, let's say, while technology takes on the metaphorical part. But in a way, there was always a mental construction of place and time, of movement, and of repose. Let's say that the spaces between the real and the virtual become a workable definition of 21st century mobility. Okay, so many of these hyperlocal egos want to move, but the magnitude of the problem of mobility in such hyperlocalities like Los Angeles is enormous, as my Egyptian colleague just amply demonstrated. And it's been criticized for being totally unsustainable from the point of view of energy, environment, safety, and the psychological burden on the human organism. And that's, of course, at odds with the amazing culture of cities that we adore. We love those opportunities for living and working, for walking around, for going to movies, and for enjoyment. And for some, like me, in LA, even the pleasure of going for a ride late at night on an empty stretch of freeway in a little sports car. But this is only part of the story of mobility as it unfolds in this century. Here's the other side. While you slept, a vast networked ecosystem was awake, whose almost organic metabolism fed global hackers. They hacked Chryslers and they hacked Teslas, since they might as well be computers and mobile phones, and they do have both on board. Uber drivers challenged the monopoly but also the livelihood of taxi drivers internationally. And as you know, Amazon tested drones to deliver packages, while other drones threatened the landings of airliners. People texted little idiocies while they drove, which is figured in more than one horrible crash. Tourists shot more selfies than they did photos of the places they visited. Identities were stolen from databases in governments and online services. GPS guided and then, of course, misguided motorists who no longer used their brains to navigate. Little kids were transported to other mind worlds and refused to go outside to play. For the same reason, gang crime actually decreased in some big cities, since electronic devices keep people off the streets. And hobbyists stayed up all night 3D printing the stuff they could otherwise go and buy. Meantime, dentists, plumbers, carpenters, and bartenders made love to their partners and talked about whether they should attend symposiums on architecture and technology, or whether they would be welcome to do so. This is some wild dynamism, isn't it? Into this context come some interventions like cars that actually drive themselves. A pretty plausible idea for the elimination of car accidents, I suppose, and accessibility, sort of like a distributed train. Locally, for me in Los Angeles anyway, this is one of the points specified in the new mobility plan for Los Angeles 2035, only 20 years from now. It's hard for me to imagine LA drivers giving up their automobiles, though, relinquishing the entitlement, the angry pretense of their owning the road. On the other hand, the metro in LA continues to expand and is actually being used. So there's a big question mark what transport in LA is going to be like in 20 years. Bike lanes have suddenly proliferated on the roads, although many bike riders won't take to the streets alongside drivers who could care less who they crash into and don't want their mobile phone calls interrupted. It's a wildly diverse population of hyperlocals, a delicious new human demographic, a kind of new species, isn't it? Meantime, however, even the most hardcore technological hyperlocal being will actually shift gears, take a break, and go for a little walk in nature. A blazing sun rises above the landscape. The evening's blanket of humidity levitates over fields and flowers and lifts off elegantly into the air, disappearing into clouds. Radiation from the sun ignites activity in the soil, where a society of microbes begins its daily rituals. A network of electrical and chemical sensations awakens, alive with motion. Little bugs burrow up to the surface as earthworms prepare new tunnels, explore their frontiers, seek a new definition of their universe, while entraining nitrogen into the soil, the future food for the botanical inhabitants above, whose roots move hungrily downward in a stately march of growth. Over 3/4 of the Earth's surface, rays of sunlight penetrate into the water. Harmonious songs of distant whales travel kilometers. Microscopic radiolaria fabricate little geodesic domes as plankton shimmer just below the waves, casting pointillist shadows on passing seahorses. Atop the liquid cover of a pond, playing against the forces of surface tension and gravity, a dragonfly skims the rippling pond where mosquitoes skate on the surface, flexing their little muscles against the pull of the moon. Elsewhere, ants have come to the surface to eat, detecting breakfast on their built-in radar from a distance of 1 million times their body length. Transceiver-bearing insects process the equivalent of 1 terabyte of data every hour, joining in a sensitive internet of communication that unites the neighborhood in a web. Spiders cast nets upon the air, weaving a filigree in the atmosphere where unsuspecting creatures that fly make their way. To take to the air is to be truly free. This is mobility. Watch while bumblebees perform a ritual jig. Finally, a scout takes to the air, hovers and flirts with a rose petal or a blueberry. The ether is buzzing as miniature motors rev and propellers bite into a swirl of wind. To move is also human. In fact, all beings in nature are united, if not always in common purpose, in dynamism, in mobility itself, to move for the need and pleasure of it. The entire range of living things sets the paradigm of community, but also of a mobile culture, of an impossibly diverse machine in perpetual animation, of hyperlocal and mobile at the same time. Just realize, hyperlocality and mobility also come together in cities where humans and other organisms, both natural and mechanical, settle, but move through time and space, our way of understanding where we are and who we are, and then paradoxically finding the road out. While the city and life has physical and social realities, shockingly enough, it was Leonardo da Vinci who called the urban space a mental thing. And many contemporary authors talk about the increasingly cerebral component of life in cities. This is pretty strange. Let's admit that we still have to live somewhere and eat real food. Skateboarders still roll, jump, and fall on real concrete steps and steel handrails. Walls still enclose human activity, much as they did in ancient times. We still need some sort of real contact with real people, and we still do have to physically move from place to place. And yet, there is this haunting, growing mental aspect, invisible structures that form in the minds of inhabitants. Luckily, 21st century urbanity lets these layers coexist. In this way, the city is a host of many layers of existence, of moving in and out, of staying put, of dreaming and hatching new projects. Yes, humans can have a virtual identity somewhere out there, a web page or a technological device in addition to residences, workplaces, and roads. People send emails and text messages, take photos, and play games, and in so doing develop the sorts of mental connections that constitute a society, as if they were physically present. But wait a moment. With this transformation, the physical world seems to turn into wallpaper, shrinks into a little globe we hold in our hands and fits inside the human brain as the virtual displaces the real. This transfer of energy from public to private ultimately reduces real activity in the urban space. So when they are not in shopping malls or cars, many people are participating via their devices, working at home, watching videos, and conversing virtually with each other. The paradox, of course, is that the density of attractions in the city center decreases, displaced to the suburbs or online. Every city dweller who remains at home is not animating the city physically. The city of busy city streets competes with another city of the mind. Here it is again, the agglomeration of hyperlocals. What happens, though, is that this vanity kills humanity, and that at the center of each selfie is the self-absorbed me, the ego that thinks that as long as I'm okay, everything else is okay. May I only be rich, powerful, and beautiful. This can be true in the tiny radius of the hyperlocal being, but what looks like an individual pleasure is a kind of imprisonment. I think that many Americans handle this by dumbing down as the education system fails and as consumerism teaches the wrong lessons of entitlement. Meantime, in the rest of the population, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and only the digerati get to be hyperlocal, while war and genocide ravage humanity, and the entitled just look the other way. This is the base layer of the city, layer 0, a subterranean darkness where the bodies of so many innocents are buried, and displaced, terrified refugees now migrate north towards European cities. This is mobility of a kind and scale that now rocks the very basis of humanity on Earth. The metaphor of layers of the city life represents a conceptual spectrum from light to dark, therefore. An archaeology of strange strata trying to resolve the turbulence of mind and matter that obviously generates these discrete hypothetical layers, but also mobilizes them to mix. So what are they, these layers? The static layer of the city is made of stone, wood, glass, and steel. We as humans and as architects create and respond to buildings in terms of space, light, and landscape. From our studies, we understand the compositional whole, vistas that manipulate the eye. This is the layer of city form, its tradition and language, as well as the playground of politicians, preservationists, and property owners, and the population of rich and poor, diverse in education, origin, and motivation, who together participate in the physicality of cities. And all have an image of this physical body. Interestingly, the famous urbanist Kevin Lynch, who basically invented the imageability of the city, noted that the urban image is not necessarily fixed. And Lynch and others, as we heard yesterday, the big data guys like Manovich and Ratti and Da Vinci, point to a city beyond the concrete and thus hint at other layers to come. Pretty interesting. So if people in parks and cafes inhabit the sidewalks of the static layer, then surely drivers and their vehicles energize the streets. In the 21st century, observing drivers in cities, one need not look very far to find such happy faces, especially if they're at the same time speaking on mobile phones or listening to music. They are angry at obstructions that slow them down, intoxicated with the addictive rush. Even riders on subways, in taxis and buses feel the push. What's more, animated screens have also begun to populate the city, jumping from TVs and computer screens to the scale of the urban space. So Robert Venturi's statement that the building blocks of the future will be pixels may be true. New York's Times Square and downtown Las Vegas may end up coming to a little village near you. In the dynamic city layer, the electron and the clock have replaced wood and stone. While many people, of course, still enjoy the refuge of the public garden, they measure the value of open space by the time it takes to get across it. Movement and electricity have come to facades, and now light seems to come from inside buildings rather than being cast on it by the sun, and many cities only come alive at night. Motion has transformed the urban scene into urban scenery. And as such, the three-dimensional reality of the buildings and spaces in the city becomes distant and less interesting, and one urban image might as well be as good as another. And yet, the electronically planar and the seductive 4D please an audience that craves a show at a time when the tools of design and construction make new formal dreams possible. Peter Cook's archigram wants to inflate, Frank Gehry loves to dance, and Zaha Hadid just wants to fly. Venturi claimed that less is a bore and placed city identity squarely in the vocabulary of entertainment and thus of some kind of consumerism. Moreover, his wife, Mrs. Venturi, wrote that it's not about space at all, it's about communication. And so now a third space, a third layer must exist, a layer of mind space that people now freely inhabit daily. We know it all too well. The relentless lights and the frenetic place of mobility, nastiness, and ego makes one want to escape. Happily for some, technology makes it relatively easy. Hyperdynamism, layer number 3, implies activity at the speed of light and physiologically at the speed of thought. The third layer is Da Vinci's mental one, where people search out visions of their own identity, personal infrastructure, and imagination. It is very calm here. She loves it. But is it really the city? Of course it is. Well, it is as real as we think it is. In the third layer, the first layer idea of place becomes the notion of presence, a network of nodes linked to other nodes, which are physically nowhere. One speaks of a presence on the internet in the form of a blog or web page, and on sites such as Facebook, where anyone, anywhere in the world can just show up and declare an identity. And this is not small. Facebook has nearly 1.5 billion accounts, the population of China. In a way, it's all too wonderful, the city of layers, and it is tantalizing to think of the urban space with a broader understanding of its dynamics and of ours. So here's another interpretation, and maybe a jazzier riff, the vision of an open university in the urban landscape, supported by technology, a sort of didactic landscape, a machine for urban education. This is pretty crazy, sort of like the Potteries Think Belt of Cedric Price. Price's vision was not realized. and yet the conceptual approach and architectural manifesto remain kind of relevant, repurposing and adapting existing and dilapidated urban structures, not with a rigid program, but infused with unpredictability, interactivity, and physical participation. What an idea it would be to imagine a city like Tallinn as such a didactic landscape, a new lexicon for living and education where urban layers, static, dynamic, and hyperdynamic, transform into three new components: being, moving, and learning. This simple triad may be a great vision for the future and a future identity and perception of the the identity and perception of the technological city. I sort of hope that's the case. And from here, maybe this little speech and this story is not a riff anymore. No more jazz, but maybe now a manifesto. While the tightly wound, narcissistic, hyper-local beings gaze in the mirror, it is up to new societies to think of another future, a better one. Estonia could be one of these societies. Small, smart, and entrepreneurial, this country could be a laboratory of the human dynamic in all of its forms, showing more of what's possible in a more evolved world. Let it be mobile, let it be technological, and let it be beautiful. Let the wisdom and pleasure of a walk in the forest also inform a walk in the city, or a commute in a driverless car that allows time on the way to work or on the way home, to ponder freely, to think of just how lucky we are, to question the corporatization of life and fake notions of innovation and progress, and finally to consider this: where is everyone really going? This distributed movement of brains might just be the metaphor for a smarter existence, a collective intelligence that displaces and integrates the layers of the past, a riff on mobility that is no longer so hyper-local, but rather much more melodic, full of human craziness and love, and much more universal. That's what I wanted to tell you. Thank you.